So after discovering jazz, I went on to practice that art as a trumpet player, seeking to copy some of the licks that I heard on those albums and building a repertoire of songs. In junior high school, my friends David Dempsey and Paul Kolpitz and I practiced a little and played at a couple of parties, 10-minute gigs at most, offering up songs like Little Brown Jug or the Pink Panther theme. Our friends would listen politely and then go back to the Beatles or the Stones or, heaven forbid, even Herman's Hermits when we'd finished. In high school, we added a trombone and a clarinet and tried a little Dixieland, and we weren't too bad. Organized chaos, mostly. We performed at a couple of the high school pops concerts and had fun getting together and playing for ourselves. For a few years, we pursued it like a religion, talking about songs we might try, sharing new records, and working out how to make a sound that, well, in my wife Ann's words, wasn't terrible. And it was in those hours of trying to make a sound that we would occasionally achieve a moment when we were all done. All we could do was smile at one another, knowing we'd found an alchemy of sorts, a special moment. If Unitarian Universalist author Doug Muter is correct, jazz fits comfortably within the context of spirituality. Muter once wrote that spirituality is an awareness of the gap between what you can experience and what you can adequately describe, which is pretty much how I feel after I've listened to some great live jazz or even gone back and listened to some of the great tracks. There's really no good way to explain some of those sounds except perhaps with a liberal use of the word wow. Jazz is a distinctly American art form that expresses in musical terms some of the most important elements, I think, of our culture. An exuberance that's hard to quell even in the bad times, or maybe I should say despite the bad times. The freedom that gives wing to so many possibilities. And also the accompanying sense of responsibility that keeps us grounded and steadily moving forward. I say a distinctly American art form because of the influence of so many different cultures that met and merged here, especially in places like the New Orleans of the late 1800s and early 1900s. But the taproot of jazz extends all the way to Africa, where music had an importance far beyond entertainment in the many different cultures of that continent. Music served as a means of communication between people who spoke different languages, and was part of virtually every social activity from work to religious ceremonies. In America, where African slaves were not allowed to speak in their own tongue and often forbidden to use the drum for fear it might communicate across long distances, music became a means of survival, again as a way to communicate and as a relief during the long hours of back-breaking labor. The spirituals they sang expressed a common emotion, and the rhythms they shared gave the music a unique vitality. As one of the greats, pianist, composer, and educator Billy Taylor wrote, "This early music created by black slaves had all the basic characteristics of jazz. It was just a short step from the most rhythmic spirituals and work songs to the first authentic jazz style, ragtime." Of course, we know that musically that step might have been short, but it took emancipation to free the sound and the spirit of the people. And then, even then, as the music moved up the Mississippi to the great cities, you know that hardship continued to be blended into the music all along the way. As musicians moved from place to place, jazz acquired its unique sound and developed its own syntax, standards of form and complexity, literacy, standards of excellence. Early innovators like Buddy Bolden inspired greats like King Oliver and Freddie Keppard, who influenced folks like Jelly Roll Morton and Sidney Bechet and Louis Armstrong, among so many others who are known and unknown, each one adding something to the mix, providing both continuity and the possibility of new or spontaneous expression of sound and emotion. And so it's gone on down through the decades. A heritage passed on, one adherent to the other, new forms arising from old, but holding always to the core values. In 1955, American playwright and lyricist Arnold Sundgaard, writing in what was then the Atlantic Monthly, did his best at articulating that which is hard to nail down. He wrote, "Jazz by its very nature is a kind of freedom rooted in a sense of responsibility. Each soloist is guaranteed unrestricted freedom, but must exercise this privilege always with the other players in mind. Between them, they possess a treasure a common rhythm, supporting a community of sounds out of which a single voice, each in its own turn, is sustained and strengthened." Sounds a little like Unitarian Universalism to me. In jazz, as in the best of spiritual community, the total effect is the result of total contribution. While great moments of jazz can be recorded, remembered, and even revered, the art itself is not static. It can't be wrapped up and stamped and placed in a neat little package to take out when you want to appreciate it. Well, it sort of can, but as saxophone Jerry Mulligan stated, the most inventive improvisation comes only when the conditions are compelling. And creating the right conditions requires an active and open and ongoing participation and a readiness born of practice. The great Herbie Hancock, who is still touring at the age of 79, tells this great story about when he was playing with the Miles Davis Quintet in the mid-1960s. So they're on tour in Stockholm, Sweden, and the show is really getting going. The band is in sync. Everything is flowing. The audience is tuned in, and magical things are happening. The great bassist Ron Carter's fingers are moving so fast along the strings of his bass. Wayne Shorter is wailing on the saxophone. The young drumming prodigy Tony Williams is cooking, and Hancock himself is feeling it on the keyboard. Everybody is totally together, shifting and flowing with the sound. The band's playing So What?, one of Miles' classics, so everybody in the audience is right there too, on the edge of their seats, full of anticipation as Miles works up to the big solo. And just as he takes his breath to dive in, Hancock hits the chord to send him off, and it's absolutely wrong. Totally out of place. Hancock doesn't even know where it came from, but now there it is, and as Hancock himself describes it, it's hanging out there like a piece of rotten fruit. The band has been building this incredible container of sound, and all of a sudden, Herbie Hancock feels like he's blown it up. Out there in the spotlight, Davis pauses for just the fraction of a second, and then he somehow, and in Hancock's mind miraculously, plays some notes that make that chord sound right. Herbie Hancock believes that in that moment his mouth literally fell open. What kind of alchemy was this, he wondered, as Miles accepted that chord and took off from there, unleashing a solo that went in a whole new direction, throwing the crowd into an absolute frenzy. Hancock had been with Davis for a few years at that point and knew Miles was always capable of musical surprise, but turning something so wrong into something so right was beyond surprise. When Hancock awkwardly asked Davis about it after the show, Davis just winked and, with a hint of a smile forming on his lips, he never was one to talk too much about things when he could express himself with music instead. As Hancock matured as a musician, he slowly understood what had happened on that stage in Stockholm. As soon as his fingers met the keyboard and the chord sounded, he judged it in his own mind that it was wrong. But that wasn't what happened in Miles Davis' brain. Davis never judged it. He simply heard it as a sound that had been put out there and instantly took it on as a challenge, feeling his way through, and because he didn't immediately judge, he was able to go somewhere new with that sound, turning it into something spectacular. Davis always had great trust in himself, and Hancock reports that those with whom he played were always encouraged to have that same attitude about themselves and about the whole band. In his autobiography, Hancock writes, "We all have a natural human tendency to take the safe route, to do the thing we know will work rather than taking a chance. But that's the antithesis of jazz, which is all about being present. Jazz is about being in the moment at every moment. It's about trusting yourself to respond on the fly, and if you can allow yourself to do that, you never stop exploring, you never stop learning in music or in life. May that be so for each and every one of us.